Louise Strong. China's Millions. Contents. Hautboys Prélace to selected works on Spinoz Revolution. Canton Prelude. Spapter I stopping in Shanghai. 2 up the Yangtze. 3 Red forces in Hankow. 4 into the war zone. V the generals meet in Chengchou. 6 the S7 orcas meet in Hankow. 7 leaders of Chinese labor. 8 fighters for /FF/Omen's rights. 9 problems of China's new IIL/Ornan. Ex-students and peasants of Hubei. Xi. R. Ed Hunan in reaction. 12 The revolution in Yangfang. XM. Fragments of revolution. I have known in my lifetime 3 civilizations, the American, the Russian, the Chinese, the 3 that have shaped and are shaping our times. I have lived and worked in them all as social worker, exhibit expert, reporter, editor, lecturer, and writer, first from my home in Seattle, then from a residence of nearly 30 years in Moscow, and now at the age of 80 from Peking. In Seattle we fought for more perfect forms of democracy in what we considered a heady God's coquetry, the world's pioneer of democracy. We won many formal battles but saw our country change to the world's greatest, most destructive imperialism. Drawn from afar by the October Revolution of RYRY in Russia, which shook the world and inspired all progressives, I wearied to Moscow and for nearly 3 decades made it the center for all the middle years of my adult working life. The majority of my more than 30 books were written about the USSR. From Moscow I gradually became aware of a new revolution arising in the East, and began to visit China on my trips to America, beginning lust half my lifetime ago in R9Z, when the Kuomintang Communist Coalition was rising in Canton. In 6 such visits my interest in China steadily grew. Even before the victory of China's revolution in Re-49 broke the long capitalist encirclement of THC-USSR, changed the balance of world forces and began to stimulate anti-imperialist revolutions around the world, I decided to come to China to stay. And now my Chinese friends are celebrating my 80th birthday by publishing this edition of my selected 7 works, taking those that concern China's revolution. These may well have the longest life expectancy of all that I have ever done. Not only because China, with nearly 1/4 of Earth's population, is today full of eager, intelligent readers, but also, and especially, because as the great anti-imperialist revolution of our century, China's revolution, both in its defeats and its victories, best gives the lessons that other anti-imperialist revolutions now worldwide will wish to learn. I must therefore glance back at the road that I have traveled, in America, in the USSR and in those visits to China which drew me to Peking as my home and LCED the 6 books now being republished. Born in the United States of America in R88, my personal career began well before the First World /Var. After taking the degree of Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Chicago in R908, I went home to Seattle where my father had moved after my mother's death. I invented, with my father, a Know Your City Institute, a combination of lectures, discussions, and visits by which Seattle citizens, many of them newcomers from the eastern states, became acquainted with the city's life. I was invited to organize similar institutes in other western cities. Their popularity led to RNY taking part in a Tia Child L7L Fair exhibition in New York, after which I continued to organize Child 7L Fair exhibits from city to city for several years, becoming the leading organizer in this field. Their aim was to arouse the city's consciousness to the conditions and needs of all the city's children in schools, health, playgrounds, and wet fair activities, and thus to create new laws and institutions through popular demand. As I felt the growth and explosion in each place of a city consciousness which was stimulated by correct organization of committees and exhibition techniques and which then created new institutions and local laws, I felt that I was improving our American democracy. This was part of a positive faith that America was the pioneer in democracy for the world. Long ago we had stated our stand in our Declaration of Independence, then men of all races and nations had come to our shores seeking freedom. Our westward lands, still open to free settlers, were the world's last frontier. Of course we were often obliged to fight the interests, i.e. the monopoly controls that pressed on us from New York. They tried to control even my exhibitions, but I felt that I was independent still. It was in Kansas City in my third exhibition, the first in which I was top administrator, that THC conditions and made it necessary to fire the couple who had worked in it and for whom there were few shanks of lobs. It worked MC. After a slow spliss night spent in thought I chitted that there was no way to correct this under our capitalist system and that therefore the cistern itself was a 11 wrong. The only proper system would put all IOBs, and therefore all work and enterprises under public ownership. This, I knew, was called socialism, so I must be a socialist. It was years later before I saw how class struggle fitted in. /7 hen the first /world, Fleur broke in Europe IRRYR4, it found me in Dublin, Ireland, running a child, FLL fair exhibition for the V/Omen's National Health Association, of which Lady Aberdeen, the Viceroy's wife, was resident. I lived in the Vice-Regal Lodge as her guest. I came back to America in a fast ship through a blackout against German submarines to the post that Al Teddy for me as exhibit expert in the newly created U.S. Children's Bureau in RX/Ashington. Just under 30 years old, I seemed fixed in a federal civil service job for life. I quickly found that L. Tashington was a deadly bureaucracy in which I was hardly able to breathe. So after organizing the Children's Bureau exhibition for the San Francisco World's Fair in R9-R5, and another exhibition on children's interests in Portland, Oregon, and writing a manual on how to organize child welfare exhibits which was published by the federal government, I resigned. I went home to Seattle where the energetic life of the coast attracted me. I was quickly elected to the Seattle City School Board as the progressive candidate, the first woman on the board for years. IO China SMTLL to NS. Seattle was a progressive city. In any hard-fought election, the people always beat the interests, i.e. the monopolies that pressed on us from New York. Seattle owned its light and power system, and a municipal wharf, and finally we bought out the private streetcar lines for city ownership. We saw this as a widening of democratic control of old even as the beginnings of socialism. We hardly noticed that after every victory for people's ownership, the profits of the big private enterprises increased. When City Light assumed the task of giving electricity to citizens' homes far-flung over many square miles of hills, this freed Seattle General Electric, the private company, to sell power at lower rates and higher profits to the downtown concentrated industries. 7 hen we bought out the streetcar lines, the former stockholders got higher, safer income on our city bonds than they might have earned by the car lines in a period when auto transport was coming in. If we saw that these victories of people's power were not entirely victories, we clung to a faith in inevitable progress which would bring whatever the people wanted someday. This was the deepest faith in the American democracy of my youth. Towards the end of RYR6 we became aware that strong forces were pushing America into the war in Europe. This, we were convinced, was against the Americans' people's will won. So I helped organize one peace movement after another, to keep America out of the war. We thought we succeeded when we elected Tudro V7 Ilson as president on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." V7 irrevent the streets and collected signatures by the hundreds of thousands. Across the country the total ran into millions, showing that the people were 99% against going into war. RVE telegraphed the results to RFF/Ashington almost daily to support the hands of the president. Similar illusions have persisted down the years into Lyndon Johnson's day. Then this America whose people wanted peace and whose capitalists wanted war, marched right into the war in Europe. Nothing in RNY whole life so shook the foundations of my soul. It/orkso. Our America was lost, and forever. The militarists had raped her to their bidding. I could not delude myself, as many did, that this was a war to make the world safe for democracy. I had seen democracy violated in the very declaration of war. RNCRIL THIRD-CRLL, happened to the third port of the British Isles, Rurk, THC Grissertxt 1. Roard of THC East. Such was the power of THC Strolling Chinksq/Orkers, based on Canton. YCTTLRC Stroll CRS broke their own rule to let me see their revolution. I took the British steamer from Hong Kong to Xiamen, the island off Canton which was still a British concession. In late afternoon, as the steamer dropped anchor off Xiamen for which we were all assumed to be bound, a small Renater boat put out for the thousands of sampans that lined the shore of Canton, flying a RCD flag with a blue corner in which was a Seeing my 28. China's millions. Amusement at her statement. She explained it. There is no place to go in Hankow except the discourse. No theaters and only 2 kinos. There used to be a band but it left after the trouble. If you want to take a walk, there are only 2 places, she continued. Either you stroll along the Bund, or you go to the discourse. Deadly clull, nothing whatever doing. This, then, as the Hankow to which I was going as the most exciting spot on Earth's surface, the place where the dice were being shaken which might decide the question of an Anglo-Russian war, with China as battlefield, the place where the form of China's future was being forged with pain and struggle under the extreme handicaps of poverty, blockade, and clashing interests. Do 11, deadly dull, she sayekl, only Kyokyang is duller. Peacefully our boatload of women steamed up the Yangtze, knowing that we were in the midst of civil W/R, yet seeing no signs of it. Lazily we watched the sun rise and set on the yellow waters of the mighty river. Beginning at Wuzhen, where its Gdiat with mocks it seemed like the sea and where its waves toss high froren Hoisen to Hotizen, we gradually watched the banks from the Florth and the South drawn Gerer. From time to time we saw an English or American gunboat, but even these seemed peacefully inactive in the hazy distance. At the river mouth, and a guide at Nanking, were small Chinese war vessels of the Nanking government. Our last newspapers before leaving Shanghai had told of the break between Britain and the Soviets, and of a rapid, nationalist move toward the north on both railroads. But on our boat a regular German gong called to regular German meals and, in the cool of evening, a phonograph played FOT dancing on the deck. For a space between Nanking and the region under Hankow the waters were bare of Chinese vessels, but presently scores of trading junks again appeared and, near the shores, the boats of fishermen. 3 hours before reaching Hankow we passed a small village from whose hilltop a demonstration was taking place, for it was May 10, the anniversary of the Shanghai massacre. A tribune was set on the summit and around it were crowds of white-clothed people. More than 20 flags waved above them, practically all of them red. We could discern one banner of red with the letters USSR. Across it in Russian most of the flags, however, were Kuomintang emblems, bearing in the corner the blue sky and white Sunday. A few hours more dragged by, during which the blazing sun of central China grew ever hotter and hotter, warning us of the hell of heat we might expect in July. Then we passed the Standard oil tanks and the miscellaneous fringe of foreign industry, and came in sight of the Hankow waterfront, thickly lined with foraged gunboats. We came slowly up to the dock of the city, then widely named abroad as the capital of Bolshevism in China, but where as our woman telephone operator knew, the unions were losing PO/ER and the red color was fading. Chapter 3. Red Forces in Hankow. TFFE city of Hankow in May RG 27, was known throughout the world as Red Hankow, the seat of the left-wing government of nationalists. It is one of 3 cities facing one another across the waters of the Yaitse and Han rivers, which meet at this point. Across the wide Yangtze, wide enough to be turbulently dangerous in winter storms, towers the ancient walled city of Seven-Uchang, center of provincial government and university learning for many centuries. The nationalists had taken Seven-Uchang after a long and terrible siege in which many of the inhabitants had died of hunger and pestilence. They mackle at the center of their new nationalist provincial government. In /Vukane, met the First Provincial Congress of Fies-Ants, utilizing the historic Provincial Assembly buildings near which the revolution of RGRR had started. 10 yen ta, issued at S7 a chain thousands of colorful posters from the Army propaganda headquarters. To the west of Hankow, across the narrow river Han, touted with iunks and houseboats, lies the city of Hanyang, famous for its arsenal and iron works, which furnish the sinews of war for the revolution. Hankow, a semi-foreign city, housed especially that part of the nationalist government which maintained contact with foreign powers, finance, foreign affairs, railway administration, the official newspaper printed in English, the offices of High Advisor Borodin. The three cities together make up the $7 cities, from which the nationalist government derived the name Sfohan government. Hankow's importance to the revolutionary government lay in the fact that it is the chief industrial and commercial center of central China. It is the outlet for wheat from the north and for rice and tea from the south, for sesamum and wood oil and many tropical grains and other products, coming to it down 1,000 miles of backcountry by 3 rivers which meet here. This also has given Hankow its importance for foreign nations, who have established here territorial concessions which occupy the main waterfront. A beautiful modern boulevard known as the Bund runs for perhaps 2 miles along the river, flanked on the water side by docks of foreign shipping companies and, on the shore side, by high modern banks, office buildings, and apartment houses. This area was formed under the control of various foreign governments, Japanese, British, German, French, Russian, each of which had its sphere of ownership and maintained its own municipal government. The German concession was abolished by the Allies after the World War. The Russian concession was given up after the Russian Revolution. The British concession was overwhelmed by mass action of organized workers in the winter re 26-27. So these sections of land were known as ex-concessions. Behind their strip of fine foreign buildings and spacious streets came the crowded Chinese city, which surrounded them on all sides except that of the river. I was invited to stay with Sung Ching-ling, Mrs. Sun Yat-sen, on the top floor of the central bank overlooking the Bund. At the end, to our building stood 2 neat little nationalist sentinels in uniform, with the blue sky and white sun emblem of the Kuomintang on their armbands. They guarded Sung Ching-ling and the other treasures of the bank. At the top of the stairs, in front of our apartments, stood another soldier without rifle. He always saluted when I arrived, not because I was important but because he thought that anyone visiting Sung Ching-ling might be. Around the building were spacious gardens where the former owners of the Russo-Asiatic Bank enjoyed tennis, but would no UV Sung Ching-ling gave garden parties to organize Red Cross aid for the wounded nationalist soldiers. The bank itself, which served as the governmental bank of the nationalists, was not in happy condition. For many years Hankow had been shut away from its nourishing hinterland as tides of military movements went to and fro, cutting off now the north, now the south, now the great western province up the Yangtze. To the economic difficulty was added a financial catastrophe, when the silver reserves of the central bank were seized in Canton at the time of the split with Chiang Kai-shek. The government piled up monthly deficits. In Hankow itself there was a shortage of lions. Very new decree or document, whether Eugene Chen's notes to foreign governments, or Madame Sun Yat-sen's statement of her reasons for leaving Wuhan. Every Renov HC Madpravas THC subject of excited comment. If he even chanced to sleep normally at night, and the light which often burned in his affiok till 3 in the morning was darkened, men passing the house after midnight and seeing it in darkness, would spread the word through Hankow that Borodin had escaped last night in his private aeroplane, which meant of course that the fall of S2Han was a matter only of hours. Totally unused to expecting any ability in government from the Chinese, and misled by the legend of the strong man under which Anglo-Saxon peoples have always envisaged the government of backward Flatians, they were unable to see any governmental force anywhere except in Borodin. In this, as far as the actual members of the Wuhan government were concerned, they you're not so far wrong. All of these remembers were constantly coming to him, not only for the advice which his long experience in many revolutions enabled her to give them, but even more for the strength of revolutionary purpose which HC had and which most of them lacked. Among them all, as THCY swaked and compromised between the Paukra of the Masrenovmans and THC Paukroi the militarists, he alone seemed able to renark out a clear path and give reasons for it. His Tisans work so sound and basked on such broad experience that, for a long time, they held even those Mernbers of the Kuomintang whose national INTES were against the movement of workers and peasants. Borodin's importance in the Chinese Revolution lay in his Koflo-stant, intelligent study of economic forces and social groups in China, interpreted by the light of many past revolutions. I have heard many otherwise well-informed liberals in China assert that the communist purpose, as illustrated in Borodin, was to plunge China into chaos in the hope that perhaps communism might emerge. I have never heard such a suggestion from AOE communist and certainly not Ram Borodin. He considered that red forces in Iankao Clarina was a heady in chaos, torn by civil strife between scores of medieval chieftains, all of whom were robbing the masses and reducing the nation's power to withstand foreign intervention. Phi believed that it was the desire of the imperialist nations to see such chaos continue, since it gave them excuse for continued depredations and increased the control which they exercised in the strategic ports. He himself asked always one question. What social groups in China have courage, coherence, and discipline enough to organize a stable government and create a modern nation? He held that these qualities were to be found in the rapidly organizing peasants and workers of China, and that the PRCPFF evolutionary tactics was therefore to organize and educate these elements, to the end that they might eventually take power and form a government. At this time it was his view, and the general orthodox Kornranunist view, that the existing revolution in China was a bourgeois democratic revolution, i.e., a revolution to clear China of foreign imperialism and the renouncement of feudalism, but that such a revolution could only be successful through an agtariat evolution led by workers and including the seizing of land for landless peasants. Only the inclusion of wide masses of toilers in the struggle, read the resolution passed in May, re 27, by the Communist International, can create a strength which can overcome the subdivision of China by the imperialists and smash the remnants of feudal relations. Foreign correspondents coming upriver for a week in Red Hankow always asked first for an interview with Borodin and usually received it. They came expecting who knows war sort of bloodthirsty extremist, most of THCR and left with such a generation that their newspapers would hardly publish their reports. The Idasian advisor impressed them New York THC finiteness of his statements, terror among China's officials, by his broad grasp o seath Sir RV Silpaid Iyab of assassin last lonkr. Flees Vikrov of TLRC Klrinsk labor movement past the bound clerics of tourist country. Only WHC and WCHRVC strong unions in China, Lr told me, will unions be able to flourish in Java, India, Indochina, and the Philippines. But even more than his worldwide Vico, I remember the human weakness he showed when I took his picture. Hurrying me away from the great court full of labor guards and placards, he led me to a SMA1L and rather wilted Chinese garden, and posed with trees and a revolt in the background. Thus he sought to fix himself in my record not amidst the turmoil of triumph but surrounded by playside beauty. His life, however, was to lead through most unplaceable upheavals, illegal organizing, party deviations and again through recantation and study to Ved work in the revolutionary ranks. There were 3 of the minor labor leaders who will perhaps never be farness, they may be dead by now in some unreported clash or capture, YCT whose lives portray for me the many-sided struggles and aspirations of Chinese labor, Yith El, the young agitator from Shanghai, Ma, the persevering trade union organizer of Canton, and Tang, the simple reniner of Hunan, out of Ayab. 11 of them are path of China's restless upheaval, one of them with conscious fiery energy, on, with tireless patience, one, hardly knowing what he is seeking, except that he wants the chance to a decent life in the world. Yuri Mofly was the agitator from Shanghai. His long, oval face, high forehead and frank sea-ear eyes were alert with intelligence. He was most talkative of all the Shanghai delegation, expressing himself with vehemence. His glowingly youthful face bore no mark of the many struggles he had experienced, and hardly indicated his TV/NT6 years. He was more like a joyously hopeful boy than an agitator just escaped from the secret police of Chiang Kai-shek. Nevertheless, he was thoroughly an agitator, having no interest other than to change from IOB to IOB in order to organize workets. What group he organized did not especially Raj Lotri. As a mechanic he passed easily from railroad to power plant or textile factory, organizing everywhere, not so much to build up any particular union as to build in all directions the might of the workers as a base for revolution. He had helped organize those workers of Shanghai who took power in the native city and turned it over to the nationalist army which later suppressed them. I was born in Anking on the river, he told me, and my father was some sort of handicraft worker, but he died when I was 3 years old. My 6 brothers gave RNE a year of schooling till I was 11 years old, then I went to Fork as waiter on a river steamer. At 16, TR became Sine Alman, and I picked up a knowledge of mechanics. At 18, I WCNT ashore as line mechanic in a public service company. Ever since then I have been interested in unions. My ED days on the river are very useful to me now, for I have many escapes to make, and for this v all the ports of the Yangtze very we 11. Yeats' account of his life is interspersed with such incidents as these. About that time my life began to be wanted by the Fengtian troops. Nevertheless, for several months more, Li San and I went organizing workers on the railway, protected by the loyalty of the workers. Or again, from here there was a battle between unions and soldiers, and the soldiers captured 14 men and killed them all at once. In another direction, 90 Li, the soldiers caught 15 fleeing unionists from different parts of this district and killed them all the same day. Almost every day for 2 weeks the procession of condemned in Shangshang passed our house to the North Gate. About 30 were executed in those 2 weeks at the North Gate by the soldiers, of whom 1/3 were women. Others were executed at the East Gate, but we do not know how many, as TLRCY could not pass our house. Lately there are not so many, but Roar there is to be a woman executed. Thus was the revolutionary suppressed in Shangshang. WCLCFT the town in the late afternoon on the auto truck. Near MC sat a Fin-looking officer of the Nationalist Army from Kwangtung. FIC had studied 4 years in the RX/Hampa Academy, and R's now in Hunan recruiting for the 11th Army, one of the Ru'arnriks of Canton. 7. Learned later that many of the activernen of the peasants and workers movement were trying to escape from Hunan by joining these armies. The rumors ran through the countryside that the peasants would thus get arms and training, when they come back, they will not be so easily beaten again. However, the Hunanese generals complained to General Tang Shengqi, and when I reached Changsha I found that orders had been issued forbidding the sending of recruits from Hunan to the Iron Armies. The city of Siyangtan, revisited on my way back to Changsha, gave other glimpses of the revolutionary conflict. A German woman who had lived next door to the District Peasants' Union, remembers 3 fights there. The first occasion was a conflict over the death sentence passed on 2 men by the Union. The families and friends of these men attacked the Union headquarters and were beaten back. The second fight grew out of haircutting performed by the Women's Union of Siyangtan City. Their agitators visited a nearby village and cut off the hair of many V/Omen, one of whom afterwards tried to drown herself. Armed men of this village came down in wrath against the city, stating, "If we want our women's hair cut, we can do it ourselves." It is not known how this struggle ended, but it appeared to reach a compromise. The last fight was when the soldiers came from Changsha to suppress the peasants, who resisted at first but finally fled. After this fight the German woman found a dead peasant outside her gate. She told me there were many executions. A leading merchant of Siyangtan said that conditions under the soldiers were worse for the merchants than they had been under the unions. The unions and employers had agreed on a wage scale in practically all the shops. Only 3 or 4 shops fought the union and closed rather than pay the wage scale. The union opened these shops itself and ran them. Since the reaction, there is much more trouble. The wounded soldiers take things from the shops without payment. But not with rough, armed masses whom one had called comrade. That was to the Wuhan progressives the ultimate horror. Thus ended the Alliance of the last section of the Kuomintang with the Communists. Thus was broken that united front of workers, peasants, intellectuals, and patriotic merchants which had carted the nationalist revolution so gloriously to the Yangtze, uniting a nation in its advance. Its northern enemies were fleeing before it, the foreign nations were yielding to it and preparing to recognize it, but the feudal militarists within IR rose to dominate it, and the would-be Democrats and liberal intellectuals, wavering for a time, at last followed their lead. /x/ The passing of the Seven-Wuhan government into a reactionary dictatorship, under the Hunan military clique, there remained no spot in all China where workers and peasants were free to organize or even to assemble. Such was the situation at the end of July R9Z7 when F returned from Hunan to Hankow, and found that the military dictatorship was in control of the last citadel of the revolution. Borodin, with most of the Russians, left on July Z7th. Had he remained Evful a few days longer, there is little doubt that he would have been shot. For the Cantonese front armies sent down river by General Tang as shock troops to be sacrificed in an attack on Chiang Kai-shek revolted on August RST and started south. Borodin would have been the scapegoat had he remained. The day he left, however, courtesy reigned. The heads of the nationalist government came down to the train for a formal farewell. Up to the final moment they tried to interest him in their proposal for war against Chiang Kai-shek. Every action of his made a swear. Since you have decided to break up the workers and peasants' organizations, I cannot work with you. Later one incident trickled out from his breakfast with Marshal Feng Yushang in Changchou. Feng has asked Borodin what was the difference between Nanking and Hankow. Both claimed to be nationalist governments, yet they were preparing to FRGHT each others. Feng had tried to unite them under his Orb banner for war on Peking. He had been told that Borodin and the Communists were to blame for his failure. Would Borodin define the points of view of the two antagonists? Borodin surprised him. There is no difference, he said. Once there was, but now there is none. Then what are they fighting for? Asked Feng Chao, answered Borodin, only Chao, alluding to the revenues of Shanghai. Fragments of revolution. Today over the greater part of China lies a fiercer chaos than there has ever been before. Step by step the Kuomintang, which arose as a defiance to foreign imperialism, has become the tool of that imperialism. Cut off by its own act from the masses, it found in the foreign overlords its support. The price of that support was subservience to Japan and civil war against the Chinese people. But in the heart of Hunan, among the broken fragments of revolution, I felt a hope for the future of China which I had not felt in listening to her able orators and clever intellectuals. The episodes I gathered, told by the enemies of the revolution, showed a realism, a directness, and orderly courage which had been painfully lacking at the upper end of the Chinese social structure. In less than 6 months these peasants, ignorant, superstitious, stilly children of the feudal ages, were dealing shrewdly, fearlessly, and democratically with food control, local government, justice and education. So I felt no incredulity when I heard, in the half-decade that followed, of the orderly achievements begun in these same regions by these peasants and workers organized under the rising Chinese Soviets. It will be such peasants and workers, and not the northern or southern generals, or the wealthy but subservient bourgeoisie of Shanghai, or the timid politicians and officials, who will have the courage to carry their country out of the Middle Ages into the modern world.